Hey everybody, welcome back to the garage. If this is your first time visiting my channel, please go ahead, click on subscribe, and also click on the bell to receive all the updates on my channel as well as these two sleds. So this is an update on the XCR and the XC. If you noticed, the XCR is off the trailer and the XC is moved as well. So on the last update of the XCR, I posed a question, what should we do with it? Should we keep it stock? Should we update it and make it a little bit better to ride? And pretty much the overwhelming response was, if we're going to keep it, we got to update it, right? So over the past week, I've been looking for a donor sled. And without further ado, let's get this bad boy into the shot so it can represent its full glory. All right, so there it is. This is a 1997 Polaris Indy Trail 488. All right. So why is this particular sled on the trailer? So what we're gonna do, we're gonna talk about the history of IFS, right? Independent front suspension. So in the mid 80s, Polaris came out with the Indy chassis, right? And they had a version of IFS, right? And essentially that configuration of the IFS ran for about 10 years before they updated to the extra 10. So on the XCR, essentially we had the first version of IFS, right? Pretty simple. It's about 7.5 inches of travel in the front and maybe 8 inches in the rear if you're lucky on the best day. All right. And this is where it gets kind of confusing. Around 1995, 1996, Polaris came out with the extra 10. And unfortunately, well, it's not really unfortunate, when they came out with the updated extra 10 and extra 12, they weren't consistent across the model line as far as what they were offering. All right, and then 1997, 1996, they came out with this guy right here, the updated version of the Indy with CRC, which is controlled rolled center. Okay. So what we're looking at on the Indy Trail is the extra 10 version in the rear and in the front, but it's a non-CRC setup. Right? So what that means is everything on the Indy Trail is a direct swap over to the XCR, right? And what we'll do is we'll just do a comparison between the XC and the Trail, right? All right, so on the XC, it's called the XC10, but in reality, it really is just a extra 10 front end, but this is CRC. So if you look, the major difference is the trailing arms are tipped in, right? So they are tipped in internally to the belly pan. Whereas the first version of IFS, right, they were mounted externally to the belly pan, or they're on the outside. Same thing goes for the Trail, right? So again, this is the non-CRC version of the IFS. With the XC, with a controlled roll center, there's nothing that you could take off of this minus the shocks and put on a XLT, an SKS, or an early wedge chassis. They do not fit. They're not even close. So what you would have to do is you would have to look at something like this, an IFS extra 10 non-CRC. These models are somewhat oddballs because, again, Polaris didn't have consistent lineups as far as configuration of this suspension. Just for example, in 1997, an Indy 500 liquid had this front end, and then 1998 it went to CRC, and then back in 1999 it went back to a non-CRC front end. Okay, right. So getting back to the Trail, right? So why did I buy this? Right. So for a parts sled, right? When you start adding up the parts, right? We're going to use the front end out of this, right? The XCR needs plastic skis. This has fairly new plastic skis on it with 4-inch carbides. It has the Extra 10 track on it, which we're going to use. It has a 1-inch shock wave, which is not studded, which is fine, which is in pretty good shape. It also has, you can see right there, a mechanical reverse, which is a direct swap over to the XCR. So we're going to add reverse to it, and then we're going to go from there, you know, and then we're going to use some parts for the XC. Cameron needs a snow flap, so we're going to put that over on his. He needs a lens for his as well. He needs a couple of these retention clips to hold his flap down, so we're going to recycle those. And then, you know, we're going to basically use what we can. This thing does run. It runs with gasoline poured directly down to the cylinder, but right now it won't run on its own. So what we're going to do is we're going to diagnose this and figure out what the issue is. And if you guys aren't familiar with an Indy Trail, these are pretty straightforward machines. They're pretty simple. All they are is a 488 fan cooled. This engine came in two variants, a 440 and a 488. This is what they call the Indy Trail 500 fan. So with that being said, why don't we drag this out and start washing it and give it some respect before we tear it apart and essentially sacrifice it for the greater good. Alright, so it's all washed up. Main reason I washed it, you know, even though it's kind of silly since we're going to be taking it apart anyway, is when I brought this home, it was only on the trailer for approximately 12 hours, and there was a huge spider's nest from the that shot in the hood all the way up to that to the tire. And when I looked closer, this thing was infested with wolf spiders. And like most people, I don't like spiders, so even though we're going to be taking this thing apart, I went through this thing top and bottom to flush whatever was living in here out. So, but at the end of the day, you know, the thing cleaned up pretty well. I feel kind of bad for taking it apart and kind of sacrificing it, but you know, one thing I forgot to mention is this sled only cost $250. It was on Craigslist for 3 or 4 weeks, and nobody grabbed it, and that kind of shows you, you know, there really isn't a big demand for this type of sled, even though it's in pretty good condition. Whether, you know, it's part of the time that, you know, was being sold, but anyway, but as far as overall condition of the sled, the seat is in really good shape. There's just a couple boot tears on the sides, on both sides actually, but yeah, the seat isn't cracked at all. It's not split or anything like that. You know, everything's in good shape. The sled does have about 4,900 miles, and according to the previous owner, about 2 years ago, he pulled the engine out, replaced the crank seals, put a new top end in it, and when we did a compression test of the sled before we bought it, it did have 120 pounds in each cylinder. So, and when it does fire, it does seem to run pretty well. All right, so getting back to current state, essentially what's going on is it's not drawing any fuel to the carbs. So what I did is, you know, the first thing I did is I tried to turn the petcock on and off. And the petcock is completely frozen. So what I did is I separated the line just to make sure that we were getting gas out of the tank, and I just basically put on a temporary line, blew into it, and I could hear air coming into the tank. So I know there's no blockage there. So then what I did is I disconnected the the line going to the fuel pump. I set up a temporary tank because whatever's in that tank is no good. It's garbage. And so, you know, and I put a new clear line in it, and I could see it was trying to pull gas from the temporary tank, but I still wasn't getting anything to fire off. So what I did is, and this was last night, I didn't get very far on it. So what I did this morning is I wanted to see if there was presence of fuel at the carb, in which I already knew that there wasn't because I wasn't getting any response, and the line was completely dry. So what we're gonna do is, I actually have another fuel pump here. So what I'm gonna do is, even before I even pull the carbs out, I'm gonna change the fuel pump and see if we can get the fire off and go from there. All right, so replacing the fuel pump fixed one problem, then it created another one. So once we replaced the fuel pump, started getting fuel, and then it started flooding out. The PTO side cylinder was just pouring gas out of the plug every time I pulled it over. It was like Old Faithful coming out. So we've removed the carbs, and one carb, and what we're gonna do is we're just gonna do our routine quick service on it. We're gonna take the bowls off, check the needle and seat, make sure nothing's up with that, and go from there. All right, so I went through and cleaned the carbs. Nothing too crazy, just soaked them and sprayed them down with carb cleaner. Pressure tested the needle and seat, make sure they weren't leaking. Everything on those looked good. I got the my temporary tank hooked up. I actually just had this running, but what I had to do, the entire lower end was full of gas, and what I did is I had to remove the drains. And on any sled, there are two drains, and hopefully you can see them. There's one right there, and then let's see if we get down, and then there's another one right over there on the other side. And those are 10 millimeter, and what you want to do is you just want to crack those open, and it's kind of hard to see now because a lot of it's dried up, but a lot of fluid came out of there. It looked like a lot of water and some gas. So I think what happened was this thing, I think it was left uncovered for a little bit, and it rained on it, and then a lot of water went in through the air box and ended up in the lower end. There wasn't so much water that the crank was submerged in water, but there was water in it nonetheless. So why don't we go there, see if we can pull it over one-handed, see what we can do. All right, so that's a good sign. Seems to run pretty well. The reverse works, all the electrics work. So at this point, this is good, because what we're gonna do is, now we have it running, I'm actually gonna get it off the trailer. Cameron's on his way over. We're gonna get the 700 on the trailer, and we're gonna deliver that over to his house and get that out of here and go from there. So I hope you like this. If comments, questions, concerns, go ahead and leave them in the comments box. And what we'll be doing is, in the near future, we're going to show disassembly of this. I'm essentially moving all the components, you know, the reverse, the chain case, the skid, the suspension over to the XCR. There will be a separate series on that. So hope you guys found this interesting.